Hello, everyone. At 9:23 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before a joint session of the Canadian Parliament and delivered a speech that has fundamentally reversed the power dynamics of the U.S.-Canada crisis, leaving the White House scrambling to comprehend how completely the situation has shifted. For 5 weeks, the United States has been making demands, issuing threats, and expecting Canada to eventually capitulate. This morning, Carney flipped the script. In a 2-minute address broadcast live across North America and around the world, Carney delivered an ultimatum to the United States. He outlined 5 specific actions that the U.S. must take within the next 14 days if it wants to avoid a permanent rupture of the bilateral relationship. He made clear that these are not negotiable demands. They are minimum requirements for Canada to even consider resuming diplomatic engagement. He stated explicitly that if the United States does not meet these requirements by March 18, 2026, Canada will proceed with a series of economic and strategic measures that will make the current crisis look minor by comparison. This is no longer the United States dictating terms to Canada. This is Canada dictating terms to the United States. And the fact that Carney feels confident enough to deliver this ultimatum publicly in Parliament tells you everything about how the balance of power has shifted over the past month. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through Carney's 5 demands and why each one represents a red line that Canada will not compromise on. I'm going to reveal the specific consequences Carney threatened if the United States does not comply by the deadline. I'm going to show you the immediate White House reaction and why officials are describing Carney's ultimatum as a diplomatic Pearl Harbor. I'm going to explain why Carney chose to deliver this ultimatum now and why the 14-day timeline is strategically calculated to maximize pressure on Trump. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for what happens on March 18th when the deadline expires. Subscribe to join the community. Leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going. And share this video if it brought you value. Let me walk you through Carney's parliamentary address because every section was designed to establish Canadian strength and American vulnerability. Carney opened by addressing the Canadian people directly. He said, "For 5 weeks we have endured threats to our sovereignty, attacks on our economy, and attempts to coerce us into subordination. We have responded with patience, with strategic planning, and with the support of allies who recognize that Canada's fight is about principles that matter to all democracies. We have demonstrated that Canada can withstand pressure. We have demonstrated that Canada can build alternatives to American partnership. And we have demonstrated that Canada will not surrender its independence for temporary relief from policies that should never have been imposed." The chamber erupted in applause. Carney waited for silence and then continued. But patience has limits. Canada has done everything possible to create space for diplomatic resolution. We have offered compromise. We have sought dialogue. We have shown restraint even as our sovereignty was questioned and our economy was attacked. The United States has rejected every effort at reasonable negotiation. Yesterday, in a call with President Trump, I concluded that the current U.S. administration is not capable of treating Canada as an equal partner. Therefore, Canada is done waiting. Canada is done negotiating from a position of assumed weakness. It is time for the United States to understand that this crisis can only be resolved on terms that respect Canadian sovereignty and Canadian interests. Carney then delivered the 5 demands. He said, "If the United States wishes to restore a functional relationship with Canada, the following actions must be taken by March 18th, 2026 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time." These are not requests. These are requirements. The chamber went completely silent. Demand 1, complete removal of all tariffs on Canadian goods. Carney said, "Every tariff imposed by the United States on Canadian products must be eliminated immediately and unconditionally. No phase-in periods, no exceptions, no conditions. The tariffs were illegal under USMCA. They are removed entirely, or there is no path forward." Demand 2, formal written commitment to NORAD and intelligence sharing. Carney said the United States must provide a signed, legally binding commitment that NORAD will continue to operate at full capacity, that joint defense arrangements will be honored, and that intelligence sharing through Five Eyes will be restored immediately. This commitment must be signed by President Trump and countersigned by the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. It must include specific provisions preventing unilateral U.S. withdrawal or modification without Canadian consent. Demand 3, public retraction of sovereignty threats. Carney said President Trump must issue a public statement delivered from the White House retracting any suggestion that Canadian provinces should or could become part of the United States. The statement must explicitly acknowledge that Canada is a sovereign nation whose territorial integrity is not subject to American political commentary. This is non-negotiable. Demand 4, compensation for economic damage. Carney said the United States must compensate Canada for economic damage caused by the illegal tariffs. We calculate that damage at $14.7 billion based on lost trade, disrupted supply chains, and costs associated with building alternative partnerships. The compensation can be structured as trade credits, direct payment, or infrastructure investment in Canadian border facilities, but the debt must be acknowledged and must be paid. Demand 5, recognition of Canadian resource sovereignty. Carney said the United States must formally acknowledge that Canadian natural resources, including oil, natural gas, electricity, and critical minerals, are owned by Canada and are sold on terms determined by Canada. Any future requests for guaranteed supply must be negotiated as commercial agreements between sovereign equals, not imposed through political pressure. The United States must renounce any claim to privileged or guaranteed access to Canadian resources. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you are Carney's threatened consequences if the U.S. does not meet these demands, and why those consequences would be catastrophic for the American economy. Carney said, if the United States does not meet these 5 requirements by March 18th at 5 p.m., Canada will immediately implement the following measures. He then outlined 6 specific actions that would represent total economic war. First, complete suspension of energy exports to the United States. To Carney said all crude oil, natural gas, and electricity exports to the United States will be halted immediately. Canada will redirect those exports to buyers in Asia and Europe who have already committed to purchase agreements. This is not a negotiating position. This is a consequence. Second, formal withdrawal from USMCA. Carney said Canada will invoke the withdrawal provisions of the United States and Mexico-Canada agreement and will exit the treaty effective immediately. All trade between the U.S. and Canada will be conducted under WTO rules, which means significant tariff increases on American exports to Canada and the elimination of preferential access that U.S. companies currently enjoy. Third, closure of airspace and maritime routes. And Carney said Canada will close Canadian airspace to U.S. commercial and military aircraft that do not have explicit flight-by-flight approval. We will close Canadian maritime routes, including the Northwest Passage and the St. Lawrence Seaway, to U.S. flagged vessels. This will significantly increase costs and transit times for American shipping and aviation. Fourth, financial system decoupling. Carney said Canada will complete the financial restrictions already in place by prohibiting all new Canadian investment in U.S. assets, requiring Canadian pension funds and institutional investors to divest from U.S. holdings over a 2-4-month period, and establishing currency controls that limit the convertibility of Canadian dollars into U.S. dollars. This will remove approximately $480 billion in Canadian capital from U.S. financial markets. Fifth, complete military separation. Carney said Canada will formally suspend all military cooperation with the United States. NORAD will be dissolved. Joint exercises will be canceled. Canadian military personnel will be withdrawn from all U.S. facilities. Canada will establish independent continental defense systems using NATO support and will coordinate future security operations exclusively through European and Commonwealth partners. Sixth, alliance against U.S. economic coercion. Carney said Canada will work with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and other democracies to establish a formal framework for countering American economic coercion. This framework will include coordinated responses to U.S. tariffs, mutual support for countries facing U.S. pressure, and the development of trade and financial systems that can operate independently of American participation. Carney then closed his address. He said, "These consequences are not threats, they are commitments. If the United States fails to meet Canada's requirements by March 18th, Mark Carney made clear that the response will be immediate, automatic, and enduring. These measures," he said, "will not be lifted after symbolic gestures or last-minute concessions. They will remain in force until Washington proves through consistent action over years that it can once again be trusted as a reliable partner. The choice is America's," Carney declared. "Canada has made its choice. We choose sovereignty. We choose independence. And we choose partnerships rooted in equality and mutual respect." The United States now has 14 days to decide whether it wants to preserve what Carney described as the most important bilateral relationship in its history or accept isolation from it. When he concluded, Parliament rose in a standing ovation that lasted more than 3 minutes. The economic shock was instantaneous. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged more than 1,100 points within the first half hour of trading, a drop of over 3%. The S&P 500 slid more than 4%, its sharpest single-day fall since the pandemic era. Energy stocks tumbled as traders priced in the credible risk of Canadian oil and gas exports being suspended. Utilities across the Midwest and Northeast sank on fears of electricity shortages. Financial institutions sold off sharply amid projections that nearly $480 billion in Canadian capital could be withdrawn from U.S. markets. Wall Street's verdict was unmistakable. This ultimatum is being treated as credible and the consequences as economically severe. International backing followed swiftly. Within 90 minutes, the European Union publicly endorsed Canada's position, calling Carney's 5 conditions reasonable and urging Washington to comply. Individual statements from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom echoed that support, signaling that Ottawa would not face escalation alone. The diplomatic message was clear. This dispute now extends beyond North America. Inside Washington, concern intensified at the United States Department of Defense over the potential dissolution of North American Aerospace Defense Command. Officials reportedly warned that losing integrated Arctic early warning systems and coordinated air defense would create strategic vulnerabilities that could take years to repair. Intelligence assessments suggested Canada is not bluffing and has spent weeks preparing the infrastructure to execute its response with Allied support. The 14-day deadline appears deliberately calibrated. It is long enough to prevent claims of ambush, yet short enough to deny delay tactics. Falling midweek and just before quarter-end earnings, the March 18th cutoff ensures markets remain open and corporate America remains vocal. The timing maximizes political, economic, and institutional pressure simultaneously. Now, 3 outcomes loom. In a full concession scenario, Donald Trump agrees to all 5 demands: tariffs lifted, defense commitments reaffirmed, sovereignty clarified, compensation negotiated, and resource autonomy recognized, ending the crisis, but at substantial political cost. In partial compliance, some concessions are made while others are rejected, prompting scaled retaliation and sustained economic strain. In the most severe outcome, no agreement is reached. Canada implements every pledged measure: energy suspension, treaty withdrawal, financial decoupling, and defense separation, triggering market turmoil and strategic fracture across the continent. The next 48 hours will be decisive. Signals from the White House, statements from major U.S. corporations, and movements in energy futures will reveal whether de-escalation is possible. An ultimatum has been delivered. A red line has been drawn. The clock is running.